Mysteries of Udolpho by Ann Radcliffe. Volume 1, Chapter 7. Reading and music performed by Cara Dahl Russell. Quote, "Let those deplore their gloom whose hope still grovels in this dark sojourn. But lofty souls can look beyond the tomb, can smile at fate and wonder how they mourn. Shall spring to these sad scenes no more return? Is yonder wave the sun's eternal bed? Soon shall the orient with new lustre burn, and spring shall soon her vital influence shed, again attune the grove, again adorn the mead." End quote. Beattie. Emily, called as she had requested at an early hour, awoke little refreshed by sleep, for uneasy dreams had pursued her, and marred the kindness blessing of the unhappy. But when she opened her casement, looked out upon the woods bright with the morning sun, and inspired the pure air, her mind was soothed. The scene was filled with that cheering freshness which seems to breathe the very spirit of health, and she heard only sweet and picturesque sounds, if such an expression may be allowed, the matin bell of a distant convent, the faint murmur of the sea waves, the song of birds, and the far-off low of cattle, which she saw coming slowly on between the trunks of the trees. Struck with the circumstances of imagery around her, she indulged the pensive tranquillity which they inspired, and while she leaned on her window, waiting till St. Aubert should descend to breakfast, her ideas arranged themselves in the following lines. The first hour of morning. Quote, "How sweet to wind the forest tangles shade when early twilight from the eastern bound dawns on the sleeping landscape in the glade, and fades as morning spreads her blush around. When every infant flower that wept in night lifts its chill head soft glowing with a tear, expands its tender blossom to the light, and gives its incense to the genial air. How fresh the breeze that wafts the rich perfume, and swells the melody of waking birds, the hum of bees, beneath the verdant gloom, and woodman's song, and low of distant herds. Then doubtful gleams the mountain's hoary head, seen through the parting foliage from afar, and farther still the ocean's misty bed, with flitting sails that partial sunbeams share. But vain the sylvan shade, the breath of May, the voice of music floating on the gale, and forms that beam through morning's dewy veil, if health no longer bid the heart be gay. O balmy hour, 'tis thine her wealth to give, here spread her blush, and bid the parent live." Unquote. Emily now heard persons moving below in the cottage, and presently the voice of Michael, who was talking to his mules as he led them forth from a hut adjoining. As she left her room, St. Aubert, who was now risen, met her at the door, apparently as little restored by sleep as herself. She led him downstairs to the little parlour in which they had supped on the preceding night, where they found a neat breakfast set out, while the host and his daughter waited to bid them good morrow. "I envy you this cottage, my good friends," said St. Aubert as he met them. "It is so pleasant, so quiet, and so neat, and this air that one breathes, if anything could restore lost health, it would surely be this air." La Voisin bowed gratefully, and replied, with the gallantry of a Frenchman, "Our cottage may be envied, sir, since you and mademoiselle have honored it with your presence." St. Aubert gave him a friendly smile for his compliment, and sat down to a table spread with cream, fruit, new cheese, butter, and coffee. Emily, who had observed her father with attention, and thought he looked very ill, endeavoured to persuade him to defer travelling till the afternoon, but he seemed very anxious to be at home, and his anxiety he expressed repeatedly and with an earnestness that was unusual with him. He now said he found himself as well as he had been of late, and that he could bear travelling better in the cool hour of the morning than at any other time. But while he was talking with his venerable host, and thanking him for his kind attentions, Emily observed his countenance change, and before she could reach him he fell back in his chair. In a few moments he recovered from the sudden faintness that had come over him, but felt so ill that he perceived himself unable to set out, and having remained a little while, struggling against the pressure of indisposition, he begged he might be helped upstairs to bed. This request renewed all the terror which Emily had suffered on the preceding evening, but though scarcely able to support herself under the sudden shock it gave her, she tried to conceal her apprehensions from St. Aubert, and gave her trembling arm to assist him to the door of his chamber. When he was once more in bed, he desired that Emily, who was then weeping in her own room, might be called, and, as she came, he waved his hand for every other person to quit the apartment. When they were alone, he held out his hand to her, and fixed his eyes upon her countenance, with an expression so full of tenderness and grief, that all her fortitude forsook her, and she burst into an agony of tears. St. Aubert seemed to be struggling to acquire firmness, but was still unable to speak. He could only press her hand and check the tears that stood trembling in his eyes. At length he commanded his voice. "My dear child," said he, trying to smile through his anguish, "my dear Emily," and paused again. He raised his eyes to heaven as if in prayer, and then, in a firmer tone, and with a look in which the tenderness of the Father was dignified by the pious solemnity of the saint, he said, "My dear child, I would soften the painful truth I have to tell you, but I find myself quite unequal to the art. Alas! I would, at this moment, conceal it from you, but that it would be most cruel to deceive you. It cannot be long before we must part. Let us talk of it, that our thoughts and our prayers may prepare us to bear it." His voice faltered, while Emily, still weeping, pressed his hand close to her heart, which swelled with a convulsive sigh, but she could not look up. "Let me not waste these moments," said St. Aubert, recovering himself. "I have much to say. There is a circumstance of solemn consequence which I have to mention, and a solemn promise to obtain from you. When this is done, I shall be easier. You have observed, my dear, how anxious I am to reach home, but know not all my reasons for this. Listen to what I am going to say. Yet stay. Before I say more, give me this promise, a promise made to your dying father." St. Aubert was interrupted. Emily, struck by his last words, as if for the first time, with a conviction of his immediate danger, raised her head. Her tears stopped, and gazing at him for a moment with an expression of unutterable anguish, a slight convulsion seized her, and she sunk senseless in her chair. St. Aubert's cries brought La Voisin and his daughter to the room, and they administered every means in their power to restore her, but for a considerable time without effect. When she recovered, St. Aubert was so exhausted by the scene he had witnessed that it was many minutes before he had strength to speak. He was, however, somewhat revived by a cordial which Emily gave him, and being alone again with her, he exerted himself to tranquillize her spirits, and to offer her all the comfort of which her situation admitted. She threw herself into his arms, wept on his neck, and grief made her so insensible to all he said that he ceased to offer the alleviations which he himself could not at this moment feel, and mingled his silent tears with hers. Recalled at length to a sense of duty, she tried to spare her father from a farther view of her suffering, and, quitting his embrace, dried her tears, and said something which she meant for consolation. "My dear Emily," replied St. Aubert, "my dear child, we must look up with humble confidence to that Being who has protected and comforted us in every danger and in every affliction we have known, to whose eye every moment of our lives has been exposed. He will not, he does not forsake us now. I feel his consolations in my heart. I shall leave you, my child, still in his care, and though I depart from this world, I shall be still in his presence. Nay, weep not again, my Emily. In death there is nothing new or surprising, since we all know that we are born to die, and nothing terrible to those who can confide in an all-powerful God. Had my life been spared now, after a very few years in the course of nature, I must have resigned it. Old age, with all its train of infirmity, its privations, and its sorrows, would have been mine, and then, at last, death would have come and called forth the tears you now shed. Rather, my child, rejoice that I am saved from such suffering, and that I am permitted to die with a mind unimpaired and sensible of the comforts of faith and resignation." St. Aubert paused, fatigued with speaking. Emily again endeavored to assume an air of composure, and in replying to what he had said, tried to soothe him with a belief that he had not spoken in vain. When he had reposed a little, he resumed the conversation. "Let me return," said he, "to a subject which is very near my heart. I said I had a solemn promise to receive from you. Let me receive it now, before I explain the chief circumstance which it concerns. There are others of which your peace requires that you should rest in ignorance. Promise, then, that you will perform exactly what I shall enjoin." Emily, awed by the earnest solemnity of his manner, dried her tears that had begun again to flow, in spite of her efforts to suppress them, and looking eloquently at St. Aubert, bound herself to do whatever he should require by a vow, at which she shuddered, yet knew not why. He proceeded: "I know you too well, my Emily, to believe that you would break any promise, much less one thus solemnly given. Your assurance gives me peace, and the observance of it is of the utmost importance to your tranquillity. Hear then what I am going to tell you. The closet which adjoins my chamber at La Vallée has a sliding board in the floor. You will know it by a remarkable knot in the wood, and by its being the next board except one to the wainscot which fronts the door. At a distance of about a yard from that end, nearer the window, you will perceive a line across it, as if the plank had been joined. The way to open it is this: press your foot upon the line, the end of the board will then sink, and you may slide it with ease beneath the other. Below you will see a hollow place. St. Aubert paused for breath, and Emily sat fixed in deep attention. "Do you understand these directions, my dear?" said he. Emily, though scarcely able to speak, assured him that he did. "When you return home, then," he added with a deep sigh. At the mention of her return home, all the melancholy circumstances that must attend this return rushed upon her fancy. She burst into convulsive grief, and St. Aubert himself, affected beyond the resistance of the fortitude which he had at first summoned, wept with her. After some moments he composed himself. "My dear child," said he, "be comforted. When I am gone, you will not be forsaken. I leave you only in the more immediate care of that Providence which has never yet forsaken me. Do not afflict me with this excess of grief. Rather teach me by your example to bear my own." He stopped again, and Emily, the more she endeavoured to restrain her emotion, found it less possible to do so. St. Aubert, who now spoke with pain, resumed the subject. "That closet, my dear, when you return home, go to it, and beneath the board I have described you will find a packet of written papers. Attend to me now, for the promise you have given particularly relates to what I shall direct. Those papers you must burn, and solemnly I command you, without examining them." Emily's surprise for a moment overcame her grief, and she ventured to ask why must this be. St. Aubert replied that if it had been right for him to explain his reasons, her late promise would have been unnecessarily extracted. "It is sufficient for you, my love, to have a deep sense of the importance of observing me in this instance," St. Aubert proceeded. "Under that board you will also find about 200 louis d'or wrapped in a silk purse. Indeed, it was to secure whatever money might be in the chateau that this secret place was contrived, at a time when the province was overrun by troops of men who took advantage of the tumults and became plunderers. But I have yet another promise to receive from you, which is, that you will never, whatever may be your future circumstances, never sell the chateau." St. Aubert even enjoined her, whenever she might marry, to make it an article in the contract that the chateau should always be hers. He then gave her a more minute account of his present circumstances than he had yet done, adding, "The 200 louis, with what money you will now find in my purse, is all the ready money I have to leave you. I have told you how I am circumstanced with Monsieur Motteville at Paris. Ah, my child, I leave you poor, but not destitute," he added after a long pause. Emily could make no reply to anything he now said, but knelt at the bedside with her face upon the quilt, weeping over the hand she held there. After this conversation, the mind of St. Aubert appeared to be much more at ease, but, exhausted by the effort of speaking, he sunk into a kind of doze, and Emily continued to watch and weep beside him till a gentle tap at the chamber door roused her. It was La Voisin, come to say that a confessor from the neighbouring convent was below, ready to attend St. Aubert. Emily would not suffer her father to be disturbed, but desired that the priest might not leave the cottage. When St. Aubert awoke from this doze, his senses were confused, and it was some moments before he recovered them sufficiently to know that it was Emily who sat beside him. He then moved his lips and stretched forth his hand to her, as she received which she sunk back in her chair, overcome by the impression of death on his countenance. In a few minutes he recovered his voice, And Emily then asked if he wished to see the confessor. He replied that he did, and when the Holy Father appeared, she withdrew. They remained alone together above half an hour. When Emily was called in, she found St. Aubert more agitated than when she had left him, and she gazed with a slight degree of resentment at the friar as the cause of this, who, however, looked mildly and mournfully at her and turned away. St. Aubert, in a tremulous voice, said he wished her to join in prayer with him, and asked if La Voisin would do so too. The old man and his daughter came. They both wept and knelt with Emily round the bed, while the Holy Father read in a solemn voice the service for the dying. St. Aubert lay with a serene countenance, and seemed to join fervently in the devotion, while tears often stole from beneath his closed eyelids, and Emily's sobs more than once interrupted the service. When it was concluded and extreme unction had been administered, the friar withdrew. St. Aubert then made a sign for La Voisin to come nearer. He gave him his hand and was for a moment silent. At length he said in a trembling voice, "My good friend, our acquaintance has been short, but long enough to give you an opportunity of showing me such kind attention. I cannot doubt that you will extend this kindness to my daughter when I am gone. She will have need of it. I entrust her to your care during the few days she will remain here. I need say no more. You know the feelings of a father, for you have children. Mine would be indeed severe if I had less confidence in you." He paused. La Voisin assured him, and his tears bore testimony to his sincerity, that he would do all he could to soften her affliction, and that, if St. Aubert wished it, he would even attend her into Gascony, an offer so pleasing to St. Aubert that he had scarcely words to acknowledge his sense of the old man's kindness, or to tell him that he accepted it. The scene that followed between St. Aubert and Emily affected La Voisin so much that he quitted the chamber, and she was again left alone with her father, whose spirits seemed fainting fast, but neither his senses nor his voice yet failed him, and at intervals he employed much of these last awful moments in advising his daughter as to her future conduct. Perhaps he never had thought more justly or expressed himself more clearly than he did now. "Above all, my dear Emily," said he, "do not indulge in the pride of fine feeling, the romantic error of amiable minds. Those who really possess sensibility ought early to be taught that this is a dangerous quality, which is continually extracting the excess of misery or delight from every surrounding circumstance. And since, in our passage through this world, painful circumstances occur more frequently than pleasing ones, and since our sense of evil is, I fear, more acute than our sense of good, we become the victims of our feelings unless we can in some degree command them. I know you will say, for you are young, my Emily, I know you will say that you are contented sometimes to suffer rather than to give up your refined sense of happiness at others, but when your mind has been long harassed by vicissitude, you will be content to rest, and you will then recover from your delusion. You will perceive that the phantom of happiness is exchanged for the substance, for happiness arises in a state of peace, not of tumult. It is of a temperate and uniform nature, and can no more exist in a heart that is continually alive to minute circumstances than in one that is dead to feeling. You see, my dear, that though I would guard you against the dangers of sensibility, I am not an advocate for apathy. At your age, I should have said that is a vice more hateful than all the errors of sensibility, and I say so still. I call it a vice because it leads to a positive evil. In this, however, it does no more than an ill-governed sensibility, which, by such a rule, might also be called a vice. But the evil of the former is of more general consequence. I have exhausted myself, said St. Aubert feebly, and I have wearied you, my Emily. But on a subject so important to your future comfort, I am anxious to be perfectly understood. Emily assured him that his advice was most precious to her, and that she would never forget it or cease from endeavoring to profit by it. St. Aubert smiled affectionately and sorrowfully upon her. I repeat it, said he, I would not teach you to become insensible if I could. I would only warn you of the evils of susceptibility, and point out how you may avoid them. Beware, my love, I conjure you, of that self-delusion which has been fatal to the peace of so many persons. Beware of priding yourself on the gracefulness of sensibility. If you yield to this vanity, your happiness is lost forever. Always remember how much more valuable is the strength of fortitude and the grace of sensibility. Do not, however, confound fortitude with apathy. Apathy cannot know virtue. Remember, too, that one act of beneficence, one act of real usefulness, is worth all the abstract sentiment in the world. Sentiment is a disgrace instead of an adornment, unless it leads us to good actions. The miser who thinks himself respectable merely because he possesses wealth, and thus mistakes the means of doing good for the actual accomplishment of it, is not more blamable than the man of sentiment without active virtue. You may have observed persons who delight so much in this sort of sensibility to sentiment, which excludes that to the calls of any practical virtue, that they turn from the distressed, and, because their sufferings are painful to be contemplated, do not endeavor to relieve them. How despicable is that humanity which can be contented to pity where it might assuage! St. Aubert, some time after, spoke of Madame Cheron, his sister. Let me inform you of a circumstance that nearly affects your welfare, he added. We have, you know, had little intercourse for some years, but as she is now your only female relation, I have thought it proper to consign you to her care, as you will see in my will, till you are of age, and to recommend you to her protection afterwards. She is not exactly the person to whom I would have committed my Emily, but I had no alternative, and I believe her to be, upon the whole, a good kind of woman. I need not recommend it to your prudence, my love, to endeavor to conciliate her kindness. You will do this for his sake, who has often wished to do so for yours. Emily assured him that whatever he requested she would religiously perform to her utmost of her ability. Alas, added she, in a voice interrupted by sighs, that will soon be all which remains for me. It will be almost my only consolation to fulfill your wishes. St. Aubert looked up silently in her face, as if he would have spoken, but his spirit sunk a while, and his eyes became heavy and dull. She felt that look at her heart. "My dear father!" she exclaimed, and then, checking herself, pressed his hand closer, and hid her face with her handkerchief. Her tears were concealed, but St. Aubert heard her convulsive sobs. His spirits returned. "Oh, my child," said he faintly, "let my consolations be yours. I die in peace, for I know that I am about to return to the bosom of my father, who will still be your father, when I am gone. Always trust in him, my love, and he will support you in these moments, as he supports me." Emily could only listen and weep, but the extreme composure of his manner, and the faith and hope he expressed, somewhat soothed her anguish. Yet whenever she looked upon his emaciated countenance, and saw the lines of death beginning to prevail over it, saw his sunk eyes still bent on her, and their heavy lids pressing to a close, there was a pang in her heart such as defied expression, though it required filial virtue like hers to forbear the attempt. He desired once more to bless her. "Where are you, my dear?" said he, as he stretched forth his hands. Emily had turned to the window that he might not perceive her anguish. She now understood that his sight had failed him. When he had given her his blessing, and it seemed to be the last effort of expiring life, he sunk back on his pillow. She kissed his forehead. The damps of death had settled there, and forgetting her fortitude for a moment, her tears mingled with them. St. Aubert lifted up his eyes. The spirit of a father returned to them, but it quickly vanished, and he spoke no more. St. Aubert lingered till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and thus, gradually sinking into death, he expired without a struggle or a sigh. Emily was led from the chamber by La Voisin and his daughter, who did what they could to comfort her. The old man sat and wept with her. Agnès was more erroneously officious. End of chapter 7. Reading and music selections performed by Cara Dahl Russell.